So there I was, Maya Rodriguez, standing in the middle of what could only be described as the universe's most expensive daycare center for overgrown aliens. The Galactic Combat Academy, they called it. Impressive name for a place that looked like someone had crossed a shopping mall with a military base and then painted everything in that particular shade of beige that screams we take ourselves very seriously. Now you might be wondering how a regular human from Earth ended up in this cosmic circus. Well, apparently when humanity finally made contact with the galactic community, the aliens decided we needed some culture. Learn how civilized species handle conflict resolution. Because nothing says civilized like a combat academy where teenagers from different planets try to beat each other senseless under adult supervision. The irony was not lost on me. Attention students, came the announcement through the Academy's translation system, which somehow made every alien language sound like a bored customer service representative. Please report to orientation hall for species classification and safety protocol assignment. I shuffled along with about 200 other students, most of whom looked like they could bench press a small vehicle. There was this one guy who appeared to be made entirely of purple crystals, and another who had more tentacles than a sushi restaurant's worst nightmare. And then there was me. 5'6", brown hair, brown eyes, and apparently the most exotic thing in the room. "Oh look," whispered a student who resembled a walking flower arrangement. "It's the Deathworlder." Ah yes, the Deathworlder. That's what they called humans out here. See, according to galactic standards, Earth is classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, which sounds way cooler than it actually is. Basically, it means our planet is so ridiculously dangerous that any sane species would take one look at it and decide to vacation literally anywhere else in the universe. The other students gave me the kind of wide berth you'd give a ticking bomb, which was hilarious considering most of them could probably survive in a volcano. But apparently, coming from a planet where the weather can kill you, the animals want to eat you, the plants are trying to poison you, and even the bacteria are having a competition to see who can end you fastest, makes you somewhat terrifying to species that evolved on planets where the biggest threat is running out of their favorite type of space moss. The orientation officer, a tall blue being with too many eyes, began reading from what appeared to be the galaxy's most boring safety manual. Class 1 through 5 species will be assigned standard protective gear. Class 6 through 8 species will receive enhanced protective gear. Class 9 through 11 species will be provided with maximum protective gear and medical standby teams. He paused and looked directly at me. The Deathworlder will be assigned a dedicated medical team, emergency response unit, and please note that all other students should maintain a minimum safe distance of 10 meters during combat exercises. 10 meters. I wasn't sure whether to be flattered or insulted. Here I was, probably the least physically impressive being in the room, and they were treating me like I was radioactive. "Excuse me," I called out, raising my hand. "I think there might be some mistake. I'm just here to learn basic conflict resolution." The entire room went silent. 200 pairs of alien eyes, stalks and optical sensors turned to stare at me like I'd just announced I was planning to eat their young. "The Deathworlder speaks," someone whispered in what I assumed was supposed to be a terrified tone. This was going to be a long semester. The next morning I dragged myself to my first actual combat class, which was held in what they called the training amphitheater. And by amphitheater I mean a room the size of a football stadium with padded walls that looked like they could survive a nuclear blast. Overkill much. I'd barely found a seat when the door at the far end burst open with all the subtlety of a meteor impact. In strutted what I can only describe as a 7-foot-tall angry lizard wearing a military uniform that probably cost more than my family's car. His scales were a lovely shade of forest green. His eyes were the color of fresh blood, and he moved with the kind of swagger that screamed I peaked in military academy and never got over it. "I am Commander Vextol," he announced. His voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he practiced this speech in the mirror every morning. "Former champion of the Saurian Empire's elite combat division, holder of 16 galactic combat records, and your instructor for advanced conflict resolution." He paused dramatically, scanning the room like a predator selecting his next meal. "For the next semester you will learn what it truly means to be warriors. You will discover the hierarchy of species, the natural order of combat superiority, and most importantly," his gaze landed on me, "you will understand your place in the galactic food chain." Oh, this guy was going to be fun. Around me my fellow students were doing their best impressions of attentive soldiers. There was Pip, a bird-like creature from Altair 7 who looked like someone had crossed a penguin with anxiety disorder. Every time Vextol's voice rose, Pip's feathers would literally ruffle with nervousness. Next to Pip sat Tank, who despite his nickname was actually the gentlest being I'd ever met. He was basically a walking boulder with the personality of a golden retriever. Tank came from a species of rock creatures who communicated primarily through empathy, which meant he spent most of his time apologizing for existing. Then there was Zara, a purple-skinned tech genius from the Nexus worlds who had already hacked into the Academy's systems on her first day just to see if she could. She spent most of her time making sarcastic comments under her breath and building gadgets that probably violated several galactic treaties. Now Vextol continued, beginning to pace like a caged predator. Let us discuss the natural order of combat effectiveness. At the top, we have the evolved species. The Saurians, naturally, with our superior reflexes, enhanced strength, and millennia of warrior tradition. He gestured grandly at himself, because apparently modesty was not a Saurian trait. Below us, we have the various Class 1 through 8 species, each with their own specialized combat advantages. And then, he paused again, his reptilian smile revealing way too many sharp teeth. We have the primitives. Every alien eye in the room turned to me. Again, the Deathworlders, Vextol practically purred the word, represent the bottom of the evolutionary combat pyramid. Weak, slow, fragile beings from planets so hostile that they never had the luxury of developing proper civilization. They survive through luck, numbers, and an unfortunate tendency toward violence that civilized species find disturbing. Zara snorted quietly. Yeah, because Mr. Anger Management here is the picture of civilized behavior. Vextol's head snapped toward her. Something to share, Miss Zara. Just wondering if your species evolved beyond the need for self-awareness, sir, she replied sweetly. I was starting to really like Zara. The commander's eyes narrowed. Perhaps a demonstration is in order. You, Deathworlder, he pointed one clawed finger directly at me. Stand up. I glanced around the room. Every alien face showed the same expression, a mixture of fascination and horror, like they were about to watch a nature documentary where the gazelle doesn't escape the lion. Is there a problem, sir? I asked, getting to my feet. The problem, Vextol said, circling me like I was his next victim, is that your species has been admitted to this academy despite being clearly unsuited for advanced combat training. Today, we're going to demonstrate exactly why the natural order exists. Tank made a worried rumbling sound that I interpreted as this seems like a bad idea. He wasn't wrong. Vextol clapped his hands together with the enthusiasm of someone about to pull the wings off a fly. Class, today we will have a special lesson on combat readiness and the importance of understanding species hierarchy in real-world scenarios. He gestured grandly toward the center of the training mat, which I noticed was surrounded by what appeared to be medical equipment. Lots of medical equipment. Like we're expecting casualties levels of medical equipment. Now, typically, he continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor explaining basic mathematics to particularly slow children. We would begin with extensive safety protocols, energy dampeners, protective barriers, medical scanners, the works. But since we're dealing with a Deathworlder today, I think we can skip the unnecessary precautions. Wait, what now? Sir, I raised my hand. I think the safety protocols might be a good idea. I mean, they're called safety protocols for a reason, right? Several students nodded in agreement. Even Pip, who was apparently afraid of his own shadow, looked concerned about the lack of safety measures. Vextol waved dismissively. Nonsense. These protocols were designed for real combatants, not primitive species who barely qualify as sentient. What possible danger could a fragile human pose to a trained Saurian warrior? He began pacing around the training mat like he was giving a lecture on why water is wet. You see, class, this is the perfect opportunity to observe the vast difference between evolved combat species and those who simply survive through environmental luck. Zara whispered loudly enough for half the class to hear. I'm starting to think this guy's species evolved beyond the need for brain cells. Furthermore, Vextol continued, apparently not hearing her. The Deathworlder's planet may have been hostile, but that doesn't translate to actual combat ability. Being chased by wild animals is hardly the same as facing a trained military opponent. I tried one more time. Commander, I really think you should know that humans have been developing combat techniques for thousands of years. We've had to deal with everything from saber-toothed tigers to each other. Maybe we should start with something less what? He interrupted, his reptilian grin widening. Less humiliating for you. I'm afraid that's unavoidable, my dear primitive, but don't worry, I'll make it quick. The other students were starting to look genuinely worried now. Tank was making increasingly distressed rumbling noises, which apparently was how his species expressed this is a terrible idea, and everyone is going to regret it. Pip's feathers were practically standing on end. Commander Vextol, sir, The safety manual specifically states that all combat demonstrations require proper protective measures and medical standby. The safety manual, Vextol snorted, was written by bureaucrats who've never seen real combat. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? The human gets a few bruises and learns a valuable lesson about her place in the universe. This was the point where I should have probably spoken up more forcefully, should have insisted on following proper protocols. Should have explained that humans had a bit of a reputation for being unreasonably good at violence. But honestly, I was getting tired of this guy's attitude. Alright, class, Vextol announced, let's make this educational. I want you to observe the fundamental differences between a trained combat species and a survival-based primitive. Note the obvious physical disparities, the lack of proper combat instincts, and most importantly, the clear hierarchy that nature has established. He turned to face the class, gesturing toward me like I was a museum exhibit. Before we begin, does anyone want to place a wager on how long the Deathworlder will last? I'm thinking less than 30 seconds. A few students actually started pulling out what looked like galactic currency. Apparently betting on combat outcomes was a thing here. I'll take that bet, Zara called out cheerfully, but I'm betting on the human. The class erupted in surprised chatter. Even Vextol looked taken aback. You're betting on the primitive. That's not very logical of you, Miss Zara. Yeah, well, Zara shrugged. I've done my research on Deathworlders. Turns out there's a reason the rest of the galaxy is scared of them. Vextol laughed, the sound like rocks grinding together. Scared of this? He gestured dismissively at me. My dear student, the only thing to fear here is how quickly this demonstration will be over. I looked around the room one more time. Every alien face was focused on me with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and in some cases, what looked like genuine fear. The medical equipment hummed softly in the background, and I could hear the faint sound of emergency response teams being quietly alerted. Commander, I said quietly, are you absolutely sure you want to do this without any safety measures? Positive, he replied, cracking his knuckles with a sound like breaking branches. After all, what's the worst that could happen? Famous last words, as they say. What happened next was like watching a nature documentary in fast forward. If nature documentaries featured overconfident reptiles learning hard lessons about evolutionary biology. Vextol started with what I can only assume was supposed to be an intimidating combat stance. He spread his arms wide, flexed his considerable muscles, and let out a roar that probably would have been terrifying if I hadn't grown up in a neighborhood where car alarms were considered ambient noise. Observe class, he announced while posturing, the proper form for engaging a lesser opponent. Note how I'm not even bothering with a defensive stance, as there's simply no need. Then he lunged. Now I should probably explain something about human reflexes. See, when you grow up on a planet where literally everything is trying to kill you, your nervous system develops what scientists call hypervigilant response patterns. What normal people call really good at not dying. Vextol moved fast, I'll give him credit for that. For a 7-foot lizard in a fancy uniform, he had some serious speed. Unfortunately for him, he was moving in the kind of straight line that would have gotten him eaten by anything more dangerous than a particularly aggressive houseplant on Earth. I sidestepped. Not dramatically, not with any fancy footwork, just a simple step to the left that put me exactly where he wasn't expecting me to be. Vextol sailed past me like a scaly missile, and crashed into the padded wall with a sound like a wet fish hitting concrete. The class went completely silent. Huh, I said, watching him peel himself off the wall. Maybe we should have used those safety protocols after all. Vextol shook his head, his pride apparently more bruised than his body. Lucky dodge, primitive. But luck won't save you twice. He was right, of course. Luck wouldn't save me twice. Good thing I wasn't relying on luck. This time he came at me with more technique, using what looked like some sort of formal Saurian martial art. Lots of dramatic strikes and intimidating poses that probably worked great against other Saurians who had been taught the same rigid fighting style. Against someone who had learned to fight by surviving Brooklyn public schools, it was like watching someone try to solve a math problem with interpretive dance. He threw a perfectly executed high kick that would have taken my head off if I had been standing still like a good little target. Instead, I ducked under it and swept his supporting leg. Physics did the rest. 7 feet of overconfident reptile hit the training mat with the kind of impact that makes you wonder if the building's insurance was up to date. That was a fluke, he gasped, struggling to his feet. You're just unusually evasive for a primitive species. Commander, I said, trying to be helpful, maybe we should call it here. I think you've made your point about species hierarchy. The look he gave me could have melted steel. I am a champion of the Saurian Empire. I will not be humiliated by a Deathworld savage. This was where things started getting really interesting. Vextool stalked over to the weapons rack, which I had been hoping we could avoid. He selected what looked like some sort of energy staff, the kind of weapon that probably came with a user manual and safety warnings in 17 languages. "Observe class," he called out, activating the weapon with a dramatic flourish. Energy crackled along its length, casting eerie shadows on the walls. This is how real warriors handle persistent opponents. The other students were now looking genuinely terrified. Pip had actually fainted, which seemed like a reasonable response to the situation. Tank was making distress noises that sounded like a landslide in reverse. Even Zara looked concerned, though she was still holding her betting slip. "Sir," I called out, "I really don't think weapons are necessary for a demonstration. The time for mercy is over, primitive." Vextool snarled, advancing with his energy staff crackling menacingly. "You will learn the price of embarrassing your betters." He swung the staff in a wide arc that would have cut me in half if it had connected. Fortunately, growing up dodging thrown objects from angry teachers had given me excellent spatial awareness. I rolled under the swing, came up behind him, and did something that probably violated several galactic treaties on cruel and unusual punishment. I flicked him in the back of the head. Not hard, just a simple finger flick, the kind you'd use to get someone's attention. But Vextool was so focused on his dramatic weapon techniques that he hadn't been expecting any kind of counterattack from behind. He stumbled forward, overbalanced, and managed to tangle himself up in his own energy staff. The weapon went flying, hit the ceiling, bounced off 3 walls and finally embedded itself in the floor about 6 inches from where the medical team was standing. They scattered like startled birds. Vextool, meanwhile, had performed an inadvertent somersault and was now lying on his back staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone who was seriously reconsidering his life choices. "You know what?" I said, looking down at him. "I'm starting to think this whole species hierarchy thing might be more complicated than you thought." The commander's response was a groan that sounded like it came from the depths of his soul, but apparently we weren't done yet. Because pride, as they say, comes before the fall, and Vextool had enough pride to power a small space station. Vextenhol rolled to his feet with all the grace of a freight train derailing in slow motion. His perfectly pressed uniform was now wrinkled and dusty. His scales had lost their polished shine, and there was a wild look in his eyes that suggested his ego had finally snapped under the pressure of repeated reality checks. "Enough," he hissed, and the word came out like steam escaping from a broken pipe. "Enough games. Enough holding back. Enough pretending this is a civilized demonstration." He reached into his jacket and pulled out something that made the entire class gasp in unison. It was a personal combat enhancer, the kind of military-grade stimulant that was illegal in most civilized systems, and came with warning labels that read like horror stories. "Commander," one of the students called out, "those are banned in academy training. The side effects alone." "The side effects," Denhull growled, injecting himself with the enhancer, "are irrelevant. This Deathworld savage needs to learn that there are consequences for humiliating superior species." Within seconds, the drug took effect. Vextenhol's muscles visibly swelled. His eyes turned a brighter shade of red, and his breathing became deep and labored. The enhancer was designed to triple A beings' strength, speed and aggression while completely shutting down their capacity for rational thought, which in Vextenhol's case, wasn't much of a loss. "Now," he said, his voice deeper and more guttural than before, "we see what happens when a real warrior stops playing games." The medical team was frantically trying to contact security, but Vextenhull had apparently disabled the communication systems before starting his demonstration. The other students were pressed against the walls, looking like they were witnessing the build-up to a natural disaster. Zara was still clutching her betting slip, but now she looked less confident and more like she was calculating escape routes. "Sir," I said, trying one last time to be reasonable, "I really think you should reconsider this. Combat enhancers are dangerous, and die, primitive scum." He roared, and launched himself at me with the kind of speed that should have been impossible for something his size. This time there was no elegant sidestepping, no casual dodging. Vextenhull was moving like a guided missile with anger management issues, and he was coming straight for me with enough force to put a hole through the reinforced wall. But here's the thing about growing up on a Deathworld. You don't just develop good reflexes. You develop the kind of instincts that kick in when something is genuinely trying to kill you. And those instincts don't mess around. Time seemed to slow down, which is what always happens when your brain shifts into survival mode. I could see every detail of Vextenhull's charge, from the foam gathering at the corners of his mouth to the way his claws were extended for maximum damage. I could calculate his trajectory, his speed, his point of impact, and most importantly, I could see exactly what he wasn't expecting. At the last possible second, when he was committed to his attack and couldn't change direction, I dropped to one knee and pivoted. It was a move I'd learned from watching way too many action movies and refined through years of dodging bullies who thought size meant everything. Vextonhull's momentum carried him over me, but as he passed, I did something that would have made my high school physics teacher proud. I grabbed his ankle and used his own velocity against him, redirecting his trajectory with a move that was part martial arts, part basic mechanics, and part let's see what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. The immovable object, in this case, was the reinforced wall that had been designed to withstand energy weapons, explosive devices, and basically anything short of a small nuclear weapon. Vextonhull hit that wall face first at approximately 40 miles per hour. The sound was indescribable. Imagine a watermelon being dropped from a great height, but louder, and with more crunching noises. The impact was so violent that it actually cracked the reinforced material, sending spiderweb fractures spreading across the surface like a roadmap of poor life choices. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Even the ventilation systems seemed to hold their breath. Then Vextonhull peeled away from the wall and collapsed to the floor like a marionette whose strings had been cut. His face, which had been perfectly symmetrical when this whole mess started, now looked like it had been redesigned by someone who had only heard vague descriptions of how faces were supposed to work. His nose was bent at an angle that defied several laws of geometry. His left eye was swollen shut, and his right eye was twitching in a way that suggested his brain was still trying to process what had just happened. Several of his teeth were missing, and the ones that remained seemed to be in the wrong places. But the most dramatic change was to his jaw, which had apparently decided to relocate itself about 2 inches to the left of where it had started. When he tried to speak, the only sound that came out was a sort of whistling wheeze that sounded like a broken accordion. "Woo," he managed, which I think was supposed to be what? The medical team finally managed to override the communication lockdown and came rushing in with equipment I didn't even recognize. They took one look at Vextonhull and started making the kind of noises that suggested they were dealing with injuries they'd only read about in theoretical medical textbooks. Multiple facial fractures, one of them was saying into his communicator. Severe nasal displacement, possible cranial trauma, and what appears to be a complete mandibular dislocation. We're going to need the reconstructive surgery team, the psychological trauma specialists, and probably a priest. Tank was making concerned rumbling noises, and trying to help the medical team, which was sweet but not particularly useful since his idea of gentle assistance involved moving objects that weighed several tons. Pip had woken up from his fainting spell just in time to see the aftermath, took one look at Vextonhull's rearranged face, and promptly fainted again. Zara was staring at her betting slip with the expression of someone who had just won the lottery, but wasn't entirely sure they wanted to collect the prize. "So," she said finally, "I guess Deathworlders really are as dangerous as the rumors say." I looked down at Vextonhull, who was being carefully loaded onto a medical stretcher while making sounds like a deflating balloon. The combat enhancer was wearing off, and with it, his aggression was being replaced by what appeared to be a dawning realization of just how badly he had miscalculated. "You know," I said to the class. I tried to warn him about the safety protocols. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in the academy cafeteria, trying to figure out why alien food always looked like it was still moving, when Commander Vextel made his triumphant return to active duty. And by triumphant, I mean he shuffled into the room like a broken puppet being operated by someone who had never seen a puppet before. The reconstructive surgery had done wonders, really. His face was now back to having the correct number of eyes in approximately the right places, and his jaw had been successfully reattached to something resembling its original location. But there were some permanent changes that served as lasting reminders of his educational experience with Deathworld physics. His nose, for instance, now had a distinctive zigzag pattern that made him look like he was perpetually asking a question. His left eye had developed a permanent twitch that activated whenever someone mentioned the word human Deathworld or safety protocols. And his jaw, despite the best efforts of galactic medicine, now clicked audibly whenever he spoke, like a broken metronome keeping time with his wounded pride. But the most dramatic change wasn't physical. It was the way he moved, the way he carried himself, the way he interacted with the world. Gone was the swaggering confidence of a being who believed himself naturally superior. In its place was the careful, measured behavior of someone who had learned that the universe had a sense of humor, and it wasn't always kind. "Students," he announced to our combat class, his voice carrying a new note of what I could only describe as hard-earned wisdom, "today we will be reviewing the importance of proper safety protocols in all training exercises." The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Tank rumbled approvingly. Over the past few weeks he had become something of a celebrity among the Academy's geological student body for his role as a concerned bystander during what was now being called the incident. His empathic abilities had allowed him to sense the exact moment when Vextel's ego had shattered, and apparently rock creatures found that kind of emotional seismic activity absolutely fascinating. Pip had recovered from his fainting spells and was now the Academy's unofficial expert on Deathworld species, having spent considerable time researching human capabilities after witnessing what he described as the most educational face rearrangement in galactic history. He had even started a small business selling I survived watching a Deathworlder fight merchandise to other students. Zara had used her winnings from the betting pool to upgrade half the Academy's computer systems and had been quietly collecting data on combat effectiveness across different species. Her preliminary findings suggested that the galactic community's understanding of primitive species might need some serious revision. Now Vextel continued, his jaw clicking rhythmically, before we begin any practical exercises, we will thoroughly review all safety measures, medical standby procedures and emergency protocols. Miss Rodriguez, would you please assist in demonstrating the proper use of protective barriers? The fact that he was now asking me to help with demonstrations rather than using me as a target practice dummy was probably the most dramatic character development I'd ever witnessed. It was like watching a nature documentary where the predator learns to become vegetarian after choking on its prey. Of course, Commander, I replied, getting up to help activate the training room's full safety suite. Though I have to say, I'm impressed by how comprehensive these protocols are. It's almost like someone designed them specifically to prevent the kind of accidents that happen when overconfident instructors ignore basic safety measures. His left eye twitched. Yes, well, experience has taught me that even the most unlikely scenarios can occur when proper precautions are not observed. The medical team that had been assigned to monitor all of Vextel's classes nodded approvingly. They had been having regular nightmares about facial reconstruction surgery ever since the incident, and the new emphasis on safety protocols was like a soothing balm for their traumatized professional souls. As I helped set up the energy dampeners and medical scanners, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The Academy had completely revised its curriculum to account for what they now called unconventional combat species. There were new courses on Deathworld biology, survival-based fighting techniques, and something called interspecies combat psychology that was basically a fancy way of saying don't assume you know what you're dealing with. The other students no longer gave me that 10-meter buffer zone. Instead, they had developed a healthy respect for what they now understood was not primitive savagery, but rather highly refined survival instincts honed by millions of years of evolution on a planet that treated everything as a potential snack. My fellow Deathworld exchange students, who had arrived over the past few weeks, were now being treated with the kind of cautious respect usually reserved for unexploded ordnance, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Students, Vextel announced, his reconstructed features arranged in what he probably thought was an encouraging expression. Today's lesson is on the importance of understanding your opponent before engaging in combat. This includes researching their species' evolutionary background, their natural fighting instincts, and most importantly, their planet of origin. He paused, his eye twitching slightly as he looked in my direction. Some species, he continued, may appear physically inferior while possessing combat capabilities that are not immediately obvious to observers from more civilized worlds. It is therefore crucial to approach all potential opponents with appropriate caution and respect. Zara raised her hand. Commander, are you saying that judging species based on appearance and preconceived notions might lead to embarrassing and potentially painful miscalculations? The clicking of his jaw intensified. That is, not an inaccurate assessment, Miss Zara. Tank made a sound that I had learned was the geological equivalent of polite applause. Pip, who had been taking detailed notes throughout the entire exchange, raised a wing. Commander, will this lesson include practical examples of how species hierarchy assumptions can result in what humans call getting your face rearranged? Vextel's entire head began to twitch. I think we have covered sufficient theoretical material for today. Class dismissed. As the students filed out, chattering excitedly about the new curriculum and placing bets on which instructor would be the next to learn hard lessons about Deathworld species, I found myself alone with the commander. You know, I said, watching him carefully pack away his teaching materials with the deliberate movements of someone who had learned to be very, very careful about everything. I never did get to finish that conflict resolution course I came here for. He looked up at me, his reconstructed features managing to convey a complex mixture of embarrassment, respect and what might have been the beginning of a sense of humor. Miss Rodriguez, he said, his jaw clicking softly, I believe you may have already mastered the most important lesson in conflict resolution. Which is, sometimes, he replied, touching his crooked nose gingerly, the best way to end a conflict is to let your opponent defeat themselves. I had to admit, for a guy whose face had been rearranged by physics and poor decision-making, he was finally starting to make sense. You know what, Commander, I said, heading toward the door, I think this academy might actually teach me something useful after all. Behind me, I heard the soft sound of Vextel's rueful laughter punctuated by the rhythmic clicking of his permanently damaged jaw. It was the sound of someone who had learned that the universe's sense of humor was far more sophisticated than he had ever imagined, and sometimes the best education comes from the hardest lessons. And really, isn't that what they call poetic justice?